It was the night before my wedding, a moment I had always dreamed of, a beautiful ceremony filled with love, joy, and new beginnings. But that night, everything I thought I knew about my life came crashing down. Harrison Montgomery, the man I had been with for 3 years, was laughing with his friends, and I overheard something that would forever alter the course of my life. "She's just temporary," Harrison's voice echoed from the other side of the door. "Until someone better comes along." My blood ran cold as I stood there, frozen. This was the man I was about to marry. The man I thought I knew. But in that moment, I realized I had been nothing more than a pawn in his carefully constructed world. The next morning, I walked into the church not as the bride who was about to marry him, but as the woman who was about to change everything. I had no intention of becoming the woman who destroyed a man's world, but fate had a way of rewriting my story when I least expected it. With a calm I didn't even know I had, I walked toward Harrison at the altar, but I wasn't there to marry him. I was there to expose him, and what happened next would make him fall to his knees, not in marriage but in devastation. This was my moment of reckoning, and the day I would return the favor. The truth was coming, and nothing could stop it. The day was still young, yet the world around me felt surreal, as if time itself had decided to stretch, making every second feel heavier than the last. I had walked into that church, not as the excited bride I had once dreamed of being, but as a woman carrying a truth so devastating, it would change the lives of everyone present. I couldn't say I felt anger or even sadness, not yet. What I felt was a calm, unsettling clarity. Harrison stood at the altar, his tall frame perfect in a tuxedo that had cost more than I cared to think about. He looked every bit the picture of a man about to marry his perfect bride. His charming smile never faltered as I made my way down the aisle, clutching my bouquet, my heart beating not with excitement, but with something far deeper, a need for justice, a desire to bring everything to light. His gaze locked on me, a smile spreading across his face, as if I were still the woman who adored him. But I wasn't. I was the woman who had heard everything. I was the woman who had learned the truth and was now here to make him face it. As I neared the altar, my pulse quickened, but it wasn't from nerves. It was from anticipation. Every step felt like it carried me closer to the final act of this twisted play. I paused just before reaching him, allowing the eyes of the audience to fall on me. The guests, the ones I had once called friends, were all watching in silence. Some of them were probably wondering if I was just a bride who had cold feet, but I wasn't cold. I was resolute. I wasn't here to call off the wedding. I wasn't here to have second thoughts. I was here to expose Harrison for the man he truly was. His hand reached out toward me as though expecting to hold mine to begin the ceremony that would tie us together in front of our friends and family. His eyes searched mine, full of that practiced charm he was so good at, as if nothing had changed. "You look beautiful," he whispered. I didn't respond right away. I just stared at him, searching his face for any hint of remorse, but there was nothing. No guilt, no recognition of the betrayal he had just casually confessed to in front of his friends. He had no idea what was coming. He thought this was still his show, still his grand moment. But the truth was about to take center stage. "Before we begin," I said, my voice clear and steady, "I'd like to share something with all of you." The church fell silent, and the tension in the air was palpable. Harrison's face shifted slightly, his smile faltering as he tried to figure out what was happening. But I didn't give him the satisfaction of explaining. Instead, I reached into the hidden pocket of my wedding dress, the envelope containing the truth of everything he had done. The truth he thought would never see the light of day. With a simple gesture, I broke the seal, and in that moment, everything shifted. I began reading aloud the emails I had found, the messages that would destroy everything he had built. "This is from Harrison's private emails," I announced, my voice carrying through the hushed room. Emails to his mistress, Rebecca Matthews. These are the words he shared with her in the weeks leading up to our wedding. The words fell from my lips like poison, each one a bullet that pierced the air. Once the wedding secures the merger, and Sophia's trust fund is accessible, we can proceed with our original plan. She suspects nothing. I paused for a moment, letting those words sink in, and then I added, temporary. That's how Harrison described me, but there's more. I pulled out more documents, his offshore accounts, the hidden company funds he had diverted for his own personal gain. I read on, my voice unwavering. Would anyone like to hear about the creative accounting at Montgomery Enterprises? I have copies for everyone, including the SEC representatives, who should be arriving right about now. Harrison's face went pale. His usual charm was gone, replaced by panic. He took a step forward, reaching for me, but I was ready. I let the papers fly from my hands, watching as they scattered across the church floor like toxic confetti. Each document a revelation, each one a nail in the coffin of his empire. His perfect world was unraveling before his eyes. The photographers who had been hired to capture our perfect day were now capturing his downfall. The camera flashes were like lightning, illuminating his shame for all to see. He lunged forward again, but I stepped back, keeping my distance, knowing the moment was finally here. "You don't get to speak, Harrison," I said coldly. "Not after what you said about me, not after what you did." The police had arrived just as planned, their presence silent but powerful. They moved in, flanking the altar, and the truth that had been carefully concealed for so long was now impossible to ignore. Harrison tried to explain, tried to salvage his image, but the damage was done. His mask had cracked, revealing the true man beneath. The man who had been using me, using everyone around him for his own gain. I stood there, watching the chaos unfold around me, knowing that this was the moment that would define my life. It wasn't about revenge. It was about exposing the truth and reclaiming my dignity. As the last of the papers fluttered to the ground, I stood still, watching Harrison, watching the destruction unfold around him. His world, the world he'd so carefully crafted to appear flawless, was crumbling in real time. I didn't feel a rush of satisfaction, though. There was no gloating, no triumph. What I felt was something deeper, relief, maybe, or perhaps a strange sense of closure. The truth, finally, had come out. The once perfect smile Harrison had worn for so long was gone, replaced by a grimace of frustration and panic. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. "Sophia, please, this isn't what you think." But it was exactly what I thought. It had always been what I thought. The late-night meetings, the missing funds, the way he'd turned me into a fool for believing his lies. Everything fell into place now, the pieces of the puzzle that had haunted me for months, even years. "Stop, Harrison," I said sharply, my voice cold, cutting through the chaos. "You don't get to twist this into something it's not. You've been using me, just like you used Rebecca, like you used everyone around you." I turned to the crowd of stunned onlookers, the guests who had come to celebrate a marriage that was never meant to be. They were all watching, some with pity in their eyes, some with curiosity. I felt no shame. What was there to be ashamed of? I was finally setting the record straight. The man I had loved, the man I had nearly given my life to, was nothing more than a liar, a fraud, and a manipulator. The SEC agents moved forward now, their presence no longer an unspoken threat, but a solid reality. Harrison's business, his reputation, and his carefully controlled life were all falling apart. His partners, his associates, those who had enabled his lies, were now on the receiving end of his downfall. As Harrison's shoulders sagged, I felt something shift within me. There was no turning back now. Everything had been laid bare for the world to see. His empire was in ruins, his business partners scattered. And what did he have left? Nothing but the truth he'd spent years trying to bury. "I trusted you," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. "I loved you. but you thought you could play me, use me as a stepping stone for your success. Well, here's the truth, Harrison. You never saw me as a partner. You only saw me as a tool to get ahead. I looked at him one last time, his face a mixture of shock, guilt, and anger, but none of it moved me. What could he possibly say that would change anything now? The truth was out, and the pieces of our story were scattered in front of us like broken glass. The church had become a battleground, a place where the lies, the manipulation, and the betrayal had been exposed for all to see. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, I felt a strange sense of peace. The burden of holding this truth had lifted. I wasn't carrying this weight alone anymore. The world would see him for who he truly was. I took a step back from him, my gaze unwavering. His world was gone, and mine was just beginning to rebuild. "I'm done, Harrison," I whispered, the finality in my words hanging in the air between us like a heavy fog. "You're not my problem anymore." As the police led Harrison away in handcuffs, I watched the scene unfold. The murmurs of disbelief, the shock, the whispers, it was all part of the spectacle now. But I was done with the drama. I was done with the lies. This was my final act, my final step in reclaiming my power. Diana stood there, frozen in place, her eyes wide with confusion, with fear. She had always been so sure of her son, so sure of the life he had promised. But now, the truth had shattered that illusion, and I could see it in her eyes. The woman who had once been my mother figure, who had loved me like a daughter, was now faced with the man her son truly was, the man she had never truly seen. "Diana," I said softly, walking toward her. "This isn't on you." She blinked, her lips trembling. She didn't know how to respond. I didn't expect her to. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, feeling a wave of sadness for her, but it was quickly replaced by something stronger, anger. It wasn't just for Harrison. It was for everything. For all the years I had spent living in a lie, for all the time I had wasted thinking I had found love when all I had found was a man who would only use me. "I don't need your apologies, Diana," I said firmly. "What I need is for you to realize the truth, just like I did." Her face faltered, but there was something in her eyes that told me she was beginning to understand. It wasn't too late for her, not yet. But for me, this was the end. The end of everything I had once believed, the end of a future I had hoped for, and the beginning of something new, something real, something built on the truth. The church emptied slowly as the guests filed out, some in a hurry to leave, others still reeling from what had just transpired. I stood there, staring at the empty space where Harrison had once stood, his smile now gone, his empire crumbling. I was free. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of it in my hands. This wasn't just about exposing Harrison. It was about reclaiming my life, my truth, my identity. And for the first time in years, I was ready to face the world as myself. After everything that needed to happen had happened, I stepped out of the church, feeling as though I had just survived a massive storm. Though the chaos of emotions still lingered, I no longer felt fear or anxiety. All I had to do now was start over with myself. Things moved quickly after that. News of the incident spread like wildfire, quickly becoming one of the biggest scandals in the business world. Criticism and outrage poured in, but one thing I realized, I wasn't the one who had to endure it anymore. Everything had been exposed, and there were no more secrets to hide. Harrison's company, once a symbol of power and success, was now just a pile of rubble. His business partners began to pull away, clients started to sever ties, and the career Harrison had worked his entire life to build had crumbled. The relationships he had used to climb the ladder were now exposed as reflections of his greed and deceit. I received a flood of messages, calls, and emails from the press, from strangers, and even from old friends. Some expressed sympathy, others were skeptical, but I knew I had done the right thing. I had done what needed to be done, no matter how painful or difficult. I had chosen the truth, and there was no turning back now. Harrison's empire was falling apart, and the lies he had carefully built up were collapsing. The people he had manipulated, the clients he had deceived, were now turning their backs on him. It was all unraveling, and as much as I had hoped for this moment, there was no joy in it. Only the cold, hard satisfaction that I had been the one to expose it. Diana, Harrison's mother, came to see me shortly after the event. She came not to blame or complain, but to say something I never expected to hear from her. "Sophia," she said, her eyes glistening, "I don't know what to do, but I can't help but thank you. You've given us the chance to fix this." Her words didn't soften me. Diana had lost the son she thought she knew, but she failed to see that she had contributed to this breakdown by enabling his behavior for years. But I didn't blame her. Instead, I realized that sometimes people can't see the truth until it hits them in the face. And I couldn't change that. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of media attention, phone calls, and messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. My name was everywhere. Headlines screamed about the jilted bride who exposed one of the biggest corporate scandals of the decade. At first, the attention felt overwhelming. I was thrust into a spotlight I had never wanted, yet I quickly realized this wasn't about me. It wasn't about the wedding that never was or the revenge I had taken. It was about something bigger, about the truth finally coming to light and the people who had been affected by Harrison's deceit. I started receiving messages from former employees of Montgomery Enterprises, thanking me for what I had done. Some of them had lost their jobs due to his fraudulent activities. Others had been too afraid to speak out, worried about their own careers. My actions had given them the courage to come forward, and in that, I found a deeper sense of purpose. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for all those who had been hurt by Harrison and his corrupt ways. The Montgomery family was in disarray. Harrison's arrest and the subsequent fallout had shattered their carefully crafted image. Diana, who had once been the picture of grace and poise, now found herself grappling with the reality of what her son had done. I could see the guilt and regret in her eyes whenever we spoke, but I didn't have the energy to offer forgiveness, not yet. As for Claire, Harrison's sister, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for her. She had been blind to her brother's actions, caught in the web of his manipulation. But now, she was faced with the truth, and it was a painful realization. Still, I knew she had her own strength. Her relationship with me was fractured, but with time, I hoped we could rebuild it. We had both been deceived, but we had both survived. I threw myself into my work in the weeks that followed. My consulting firm, which had started as a small venture, now began to grow rapidly. Companies were seeking our services to help with corporate transparency, to make sure they didn't fall into the same traps that Montgomery Enterprises had. My firm's reputation grew, and with it, I felt a sense of empowerment that I had never known before. I began working closely with clients who were looking for ethical leadership, helping them build better, more transparent businesses. It was the opposite of everything Harrison had stood for. And as I helped these businesses restructure, I realized that in many ways, I was restructuring my own life, too. The more I worked, the more I saw that this wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about building something better. I was creating a new foundation for myself, a new future, one built on integrity, trust, and transparency. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Every step I took forward felt like a victory, not just for me, but for all the people who had been silenced by lies. One evening, I sat in my apartment, looking out over the city's skyline. The chaos of the past few months had settled into something more manageable. The constant buzz of my phone had quieted down, and I finally had a moment to breathe. The weight I had carried for so long, the burden of knowing the truth but having no one to tell it to, had lifted. I felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't a peace born from revenge or anger. It was a peace that came from knowing I had done the right thing. I had exposed the truth, and in doing so, I had reclaimed my life. The woman who had once been a victim of Harrison's manipulation was now someone unrecognizable, a woman who stood tall, who knew her worth, and who had learned to trust herself. As I sat there, my phone buzzed with a message from Claire. I had avoided speaking with her for a while. I wasn't sure if we were ready to rebuild our relationship, but I knew the time had come. It wasn't going to be easy, but I couldn't move forward without acknowledging the past. Sophia, I know we've both been through a lot, and I know I was blind to everything Harrison did, but I want to make things right. I'm so sorry for not seeing the truth sooner. I took a deep breath, staring at the screen. It was the first step. I didn't know what the future held for me and Claire, but I knew that reconciliation wasn't just for the sake of peace, it was for the sake of healing. With a steady hand, I typed my response. I'm willing to listen, Claire. Let's start with the truth. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to face whatever came next. The days following Claire's message were filled with a mixture of uncertainty and hope. Rebuilding relationships, especially after so much betrayal, was never going to be easy. But I knew that true healing started with honesty, and that was the path I was determined to walk. Claire and I exchanged messages, and slowly, we began to talk about what had happened. I could sense her regret, and in a way, it mirrored the way I had felt at the beginning of my journey. But with every conversation, I could also sense something else: strength. Claire wasn't the naive woman I had once known. She had been through the fire just as I had, and perhaps, just perhaps, we could emerge from it stronger. We agreed to meet at a quiet cafe one rainy afternoon. When I arrived, she was already sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. The sight of her made my heart clench with a mixture of emotions: anger, sadness, but most of all, relief. It was time. Sophia, Claire started, but I held up my hand. Let's just talk, okay? I'm not here to blame you, Claire. I know it's not easy seeing the truth, especially when you've been blinded by love. I just want us to understand each other. Claire nodded, her eyes downcast, but she was listening. We spoke for hours that afternoon, not about the past, but about what had come after. We talked about the new path both of us had taken, how she had taken over a small division of Montgomery Enterprises, determined to rebuild it with honesty and integrity. I spoke about my consulting firm, how it had grown, and how I had helped companies rebuild their cultures after scandals. Slowly, we began to see the common ground: the desire for redemption, not just for ourselves, but for the world around us. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about using it as a foundation for something better. And I could see that Claire was finally understanding that, just as I had. As the months passed, the investigation into Harrison's crimes deepened. New revelations came to light, and it became clear that he had manipulated not only the company but the people around him, using them as pawns in his grand game. The media continued to follow his downfall with gleeful anticipation, but I knew that for me, it wasn't about Harrison anymore. It was about the work I was doing, the people I was helping, and the life I was finally building for myself. The court trial was fast approaching, and I received a call from the prosecutors asking if I would testify. The thought of stepping back into that courtroom, recounting all the ways Harrison had manipulated me, made my stomach churn. But I knew it was a necessary part of the process. For him to face the full consequences of his actions, he needed to see how many lives he had destroyed. When I entered the courtroom on the day of the trial, I felt calm. I had prepared myself for this moment. I walked to the witness stand, feeling the eyes of the jury and the public on me, but I wasn't scared. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. I was no longer the woman who had been deceived. I was the woman who had exposed the truth, and I was ready to stand firm. The trial lasted for weeks, each day revealing more of Harrison's dark secrets, his offshore accounts, the embezzlement, the manipulation. I watched as his carefully crafted image crumbled piece by piece, but it was the final day, when his mother, Diana, took the stand that shook the courtroom to its core. Her testimony was unexpected but necessary. She spoke of Harrison's upbringing, how she had tried to teach him the values of honesty and integrity, and how, despite her best efforts, he had chosen a different path. The weight of her words hung in the air. For the first time, Harrison's own mother was acknowledging the truth about her son. It was a devastating moment for her, but also a turning point. Diana had finally recognized the consequences of her own actions, her role in enabling Harrison's deceit. When the verdict was read, I was no longer surprised by the outcome. Harrison was guilty on all counts, and the sentence was harsh. 15 years in prison with no possibility of parole. As the courtroom emptied, I felt a strange sense of peace. The justice I had been waiting for had been served, but it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something else. In the weeks that followed, I found myself moving forward, piece by piece. The foundation I had created to help businesses avoid fraud continued to grow, and the impact of my work spread further than I had ever imagined. Claire and I, despite our past, began to rebuild our relationship. We didn't need to be best friends, but we could now move forward with mutual respect, knowing we had both learned valuable lessons from our experiences. Diana, too, began to change. I had always seen her as a mother figure, but in the end, it was her own transformation that left the most impact on me. She had seen the truth, not just about her son, but about the values that really mattered. Slowly, she started working with the foundation, using her connections to promote ethical business practices. And as for me, I was no longer that woman at the altar, waiting for a man who never deserved my love. I was no longer a victim. I was a woman who had found her voice, her purpose, and her strength. It wasn't easy, but I had rebuilt my life on a foundation of truth, and for the first time in years, I felt whole. As the months turned into years, the remnants of my past life with Harrison became nothing more than distant memories. The pain of betrayal had faded, replaced by the pride of what I had built for myself. A life grounded in truth and integrity. I had long since moved out of the penthouse, leaving behind the grand life Harrison had promised, and started fresh in a quiet apartment with views of the city I had come to love. There, I had everything I needed: peace, independence, and a sense of self I had never known before. Marcus had become an essential part of this new chapter. Our professional partnership turned personal over time. What started as mutual respect for our shared vision for business ethics soon blossomed into something deeper. He was everything Harrison never was: kind, honest, and most of all, he respected me. Our conversations went from strategy and ethics to dreams and plans for the future. We never rushed, never pushed, but in each other's company we found something real, a love that was built on trust, shared goals, and mutual admiration. One evening, as we walked through the city, I could feel the weight of everything that had happened slowly fading behind me. We had been through so much, yet here we were, walking side by side, building something better than either of us had ever imagined. It wasn't just about love or business anymore, it was about partnership, about growing together and learning from our mistakes. The foundation had grown exponentially, with new initiatives and global reach. We were no longer just a small consulting firm helping businesses avoid fraud. We were now a recognized force for corporate transparency. The work we were doing was making a tangible difference. More than ever, I felt that I was exactly where I was meant to be, doing the work that I was passionate about, helping others learn from my story. As the sun set over the city, I received a call from Claire. She had been doing well, focusing on her own career, and her division at Montgomery Enterprises had finally turned the corner. She had started rebuilding the company from the inside out, emphasizing transparency and accountability at every level. The legacy of Harrison's empire was now being redefined, and she was at the forefront of it. "How's everything going?" I asked, smiling as I spoke to her. "Good, better than I thought," she replied. "I've got a new project coming up. I think it's going to make a real impact." I was proud of her. Despite everything, Claire had found her path. She wasn't the same person I had known before. She was stronger, wiser, and no longer blinded by family loyalty. It wasn't long before we received an invitation from Diana, one that marked a significant change in her life. She wanted to meet with us to discuss something important. I wasn't sure what to expect, but when we arrived at her home, the tension that had once hung between us seemed to have dissolved. Diana had undergone her own transformation, one that had come with its own price. She had finally accepted the truth, not just about Harrison, but about herself and the way she had enabled his behavior. "I've come to terms with everything," she said quietly, her voice steady, "and I want to make it right for all of us." She handed me a small velvet box, the same one that had once held the Montgomery pearls, the symbol of the family legacy. But this time, it wasn't a gift filled with the weight of lies, it was a symbol of redemption. "These belong to you now," she said softly. "You've earned them, Sophia. You saved us all from becoming something we never should have been." I held the box in my hands, feeling its coldness, but it no longer felt like a burden. It was a reminder of the strength it had taken to expose the truth and how far we had all come since that fateful day. As I left Diana's house that day, I felt a sense of finality, not just with the past, but with the chapter of my life that had defined who I was. The journey had been painful, but it had taught me invaluable lessons. It had shown me that sometimes the greatest love story isn't about finding the perfect partner, but about finding the strength to stand on your own, to choose truth over comfort, and to never settle for anything less than what you deserve. The next year, as I stood on stage at the annual ethics conference in New York, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come. The audience was filled with industry leaders, students, and people who had come to hear the story of the runaway bride who had exposed corporate fraud. But I wasn't just sharing my story, I was sharing a message about transformation, about how the greatest revenge isn't in destroying someone else, but in rebuilding from the wreckage. My work, my firm, my life, it was all a testament to the power of redemption. And as I looked out into the crowd, I saw faces of people who had been affected by the work we were doing. People who had chosen to live with integrity, to put truth above all else. And in that moment, I knew that everything I had gone through, the pain, the heartbreak, the betrayal, had led me here, to this place where I could truly make a difference. As Marcus and I walked home that evening, hand in hand, I felt the weight of the past settle into its rightful place. It was no longer an anchor weighing me down. It was the foundation upon which I had built something far greater than I had ever imagined. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had led me to a place where I was finally at peace with who I was, with who I had become. And as we reached our apartment, I knew that whatever the future held, I was ready. I had faced the truth, embraced the lessons, and most importantly, had the courage to move forward. And that was all I needed. The best revenge, after all, isn't about destroying someone else's world. It's about building your own from the ground up with truth, integrity, and love.